Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at a battle of the bots. We're going to look at some games that were played between the strongest engine on chess.com, that being Mittens, of course, and the strongest engine on Lichess, which is Stockfish. Now, I recently did a video where I played against Stockfish level 7 and level 8. Probably will have a link below so you can watch that video as well. But here we're going to see Stockfish take on Mittens and which computer will show its supremacy. All right, so in the first game, we have Stockfish level 7 playing against Mittens. Now, to be clear, when I say Mittens, we're talking about the strongest engine on chess.com, level 25 with an elo of 3200. So the first game starts off with this move b3 here, trying to fianchetto the bishop to b2 from Stockfish. We got e5 being played by Mittens, bishop b2 and knight c6. Now, in a very recent video, which I covered the Grand Chess Tour event being played in Warsaw, Poland, there was a game where Magnus Carlsen, the former world chess champion, played 1b3 against Wesley. So I would also add that I myself have been a big proponent of this opening. I've had this exact position many different times with the white pieces against various grandmasters like Vita Gujarati, Eric Hansen, I think even Wesley So, etc. The list goes on and on. Now, Stockfish decides here to play this move e4, which is a very interesting move. Normally, the move that white plays here is e3, and the point being that after d5, white can go bishop b5 and put pressure immediately on both of these diagonals with the two great bishops. Instead, we get e4 being played by Stockfish. Mittens plays knight to f6, developing the knight and attacking the pawn in the center. We get d3 being played here by Stockfish. Now, it's worth noting that since I played b3 so many times online, I'm almost certain I've had this exact position with the white pieces, and usually I've played the move knight to c3 here. Stockfish, however, decides to play d3. We get d5, putting pressure on the pawn on e4. Black, there's a big black center potentially, and a lot of chaos, and white has some issues to deal with. So we get knight to d2 being played by Stockfish, bishop to c5, and now we have this move bishop to e2. Now, at first glance, knight f3 looks like a better move, but if you play knight f3, putting pressure on the pawn on e5, there's knight to g4, and suddenly there are all these massive threats towards this pawn next to the white king, and there's really no good way of defending this weakness. So here we get bishop e2, and now we get pawn takes pawn, and here Mittens decides to castle. Now, it's a little surprising to see this move castles because to my untrained eye, knight to g4 looks like a very strong move, putting pressure on the pawn on f2, and if white captures the knight, it's not a free knight because now you have queen h4 threatening both the bishop on g4, but also the checkmate on f2 as well. And if white plays a move like g3 after queen takes g4, black should be better. Now, at first glance, you're probably like, well, why does that look so interesting to you? And the reason is because this position is actually very, very similar to another opening with this exact same theme, and that opening would be the Philidors. So let me flip the board around here for a second and look at it from the white perspective. So we have this opening with e4, e5, knight to f3, d6, d4, knight to d7, and here white plays this move bishop c4, black goes bishop to e7, you play this move pawn takes pawn, and now after castles in c6, there is this move knight to g5 here, and after bishop takes g5, you have queen to h5 here, hitting both the bishop on g5 as well as the pawn on f7. And in this position, black normally plays g6, and after queen takes g5, white is a little bit better with the bishop pair. So now let's contrast this to the game. So when we get back to this position in the game, you'll notice that if I flip the board around, it's a very, very similar position. The only difference being that white has played b3 and bishop b2, instead of having the pawns on c3 and b2 and the bishop on c1. So I'm a little surprised that Mittens did not choose to play knight g4, but alas, it is 3200. Obviously, it knows chess a little bit better than I do. So Mittens castles, we get the move knight g to f3, knight to h5 played here by Mittens. Idea of putting the knight on f4, as Gary Kimovich Kasparov said all those many years ago, knight on f4 is worth at least one pawn. So here we get knight c4 played by Stockfish, trying to overload and put maximum pressure on the pawn on e5. Knight to f4 played, we get castles, and now pawn to f6 here. Mittens, of course, building this big center, this chain of three pawns, combined with this great outpost knight on f4, black is doing very well. That being said, of course, when you see the advantage being 0.3 in favor of Mittens here, at computer play, 0.3 is not enough to win the game. It's just not a big enough advantage. So here we get bishop to c1, the queens come off the board, and now Mittens plays this move bishop to e6, trying to potentially trade the bishop for the knight. Let's just say white plays h3. After you trade, you can play something like knight a5 and put a lot of pressure on this pawn on c4. These weak isolated double pawns here are just really not great for white. So of course Stockfish plays knight to b2, avoiding the trade of the bishop for the knight on c4. We get rook a d8, and now this move bishop takes f4 is played, and after e takes f4, now this move knight d3 comes in here, and Stockfish all of a sudden has this great knight on d3, targeting both the bishop and the pawn at the same time. This is a fork here. So Mittens avoids losing material, drop the bishop, guard the pawn, nothing is hanging anymore, and now we get rook to e1. Now here black has two bishops on e6 and d6. White has D's knights on d3 and f3, but with the bishop pair, black should be a little bit better. And I honestly want to say that if I was playing this position with the black piece against, say, Magnus Carlsen, I think there are very good chances I would win. Conversely, I think if he had the black piece against me, it's very likely he would win this position against me. But I will say that I think if either of us had this position with the black piece against the computer, most likely we would draw this, but I would say something like 20% chance we draw the game, 80% chance that we lose, even though it's an end game, even though you have the bishop pair, because computers are just that good. So we get knight to b4 being played here by Mittens. e5 played by Stockfish. Now again, you don't really want to trade the knights here, because if you trade the knights and go rook f1, black can put this bishop on c3, and after rook b1, rook e8, there's some pressure towards this pawn on e4. Black controls the open file, and it's definitely an advantage. So we get e5 played by Stockfish. Your idea, get rid of weakness, potentially open up a diagonal down the road for the light square bishop as well. Mittens trades the knights, takes on e5, knight takes e5, and now we get rook f e8. Really nice looking position for black with the rooks on the e and the d files and these great bishops in the center. But here we see the move bishop to f3, and white has now activated this very passive bishop. If we go back to this position all the way back here, this bishop is very passive. It has no scope on the diagonals. It's guarding a pawn, but it's just not doing a whole lot. But now when we look at the transformation with the bishop on f3 here, out of nowhere, this is a great bishop. It has multiple diagonals, and now white only has one weakness on d3, but white also has an open e file for the rook on e1 as well, so it should be good enough to save the game. We got d4 being played here by Stockfish, and now we have bishop to b4, rook to e4, g5 played here, overprotecting the pawn on f4. Now it's worth noting that on first glance you might think, well wait, white has d5, you create a fossil, both bishops under attack, white should be doing very well, but not so fast. After d5, black can play bishop to c3, attacking the rook in the corner and the knight at the same time. If you take the bishop, you lose the rook, and white has sacked the rook, and in this case it's not a good sacrifice. If white tries to move the rook to say c1, now after bishop takes d5, white is completely lost. Your rook is under attack, your knight is under attack. White is going to be suffering some heavy material losses at the very least, if not in fact getting checkmated. For example, if rook takes bishop, bishop takes rook, white takes back. Temporarily, white has a bishop and knight for a rook, but black has rook d1, creating the classic ice skater checkmate on the back rank, and that's all she wrote. So here Stockfish decides to play rook to c1. We get bishop to a3, rook to f1, and now bishop d5, rook e to e1 is played. Now the problem for black here is that white has a great outposted knight on e5. It's a great bastion here, and additionally, all roads where you end up winning, say this pawn on d4, for example, just to illustrate the point, there always are going to be chances for white to draw the game with the classic kebab with the rook on the 7th rank. So it's going to be very difficult to prove a significant advantage here. So we get bishop b4, rook to b1, bishop c3, and now Stockfish plays bishop h5, and after rook to e7, it goes rook f to d1. Now the point behind playing bishop h5 is that essentially what Stockfish wants to avoid is a situation like this, where after c5, if you take, there's rook takes knight, and black guards the bishop, and if you trade the bishops here, suddenly the pawn is very weak, the knight is under attack, and white's in a lot of trouble here. So by putting the bishop on h5 and playing rook f d1, now if black goes c5 here, you can play knight to f3, and after pawn takes pawn, white can play knight takes. If bishop e4, trying to win the knight or the rook here potentially, white can go knight to b5, attacking the bishop and the rook. So suddenly both sides are creating all these massive attacks, and now after rook takes, rook takes, let's just say bishop f6, white can play something like h3 followed by knight d6 and bishop f3, and white should be completely fine, and the game should end in a draw. So we get bishop to e4, rook to c1, and now bishop b2 played by Mittens. Here Stockfish goes rook c4, trying to protect the pawn twice. Worth noting that if black plays bishop takes pawn, for example, white can go knight to f3 here. And now if you move the bishop to guard the rook, after rook takes rook, bishop takes, knight takes pawn on g5, white has equalized completely. And if you play the move bishop takes knight, after bishop takes, black is up a pawn here. Potentially you can even get a nice wooden shield here in the middle of the board. Although if you go c5 right away, there is rook takes c5. So let's just say you can get king g7, for example, and white goes like rook to e1, takes, rook d7, rook d1. Black is still better here with c5 and creating the wooden shield, but due to the opposite color bishops here, a dark square bishop versus a light square bishop, at this level, 3200 plus, computers will never lose this position. This is a technical draw, and computers will draw us 100 times out of 100. So here we get bishop b2, rook to c4. Now, one other point I want to illustrate is that endgame. It's worth noting that while this endgame here would be, let me just set up the position, this endgame would be a perfect draw with computer play. In human practice, you're happy to have this position because with the extra pawn, you can try to play on forever, grind down your opponent, get them tired. They're going to be feeling some stress, some nerves, so they're trying to defend, whereas a computer will just play the best move. No stress, no sweat, no worries. Actually, frankly, no thoughts other than playing the best move. So against a computer, it just would not work. But in human play, this is actually a great position to have. And most likely in this sort of position against a human, I would go for that variation, whereas against a computer, you don't go for it because the computer will play it perfectly and draw it every single time. So we get bishop b2, rook to c4, and now we have bishop to d5, rook to c5 being played here by Stockfish, and now we get bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, and rook takes e5. And here we have a similar situation where black has one extra pawn, but in this case it's bishops of the same color. Both sides have light square bishops, so chances of winning are significantly higher. Now here Stockfish plays h4, an excellent move trying to weaken the black structure. You could take the pawn on h4, but after bishop to f3, there are a lot of problems. You're dealing with multiple pins here from the two rooks on d4 and c5. Additionally, your pawn on f4 is very weak, and if f4 falls, h4 will fall as well. And the computer here thinks that black doesn't even have an advantage anymore. So we get h6, keeping the chain intact here. We get bishop to f3 being played by Stockfish, king to f7, h takes g5, h takes g5, and now we have bishop takes bishop, rook takes bishop, takes, and rook c2. Of course, white does not want to trade the rooks on d5, because if you trade the rooks, now black has an extra pawn in a king and pawn endgame, and with only pawns on the board, I assume this should be winning here. After king d3, you can probably go g4 here, and let's say white goes g3, you trade, go d4 here, and after king d2, king e4, king e2, d3, king d2, king f3, you win the pawn, you go king h2, and you can roll the g pawn down the board, and it's a very simple GG, why not? So we get rook c2, king to e6 played, king f1, king f5, king e2, and now g4. Now again, this is the interesting thing. In computer play, this position is still probably a draw with perfect play, but in human practice, I think that any human who has this position with black, let's just use an example, say Wesley So with the black pieces against, say, Magnus Carlsen. I think Wesley would win this position probably like 85% of the time, but in computer play, this is still likely to be a draw like 95% plus of the time. So after g4, we get rook c4, rook to e5, king to d2. Now we have f3 being played, takes. We get a4 played here by Stockfish, and another incredible move here, because what Stockfish understands is that here, the black king is cut off from the fourth rank. The king cannot move forward. So even once you play rook to e2 and take the pawn on f2 here, you can go rook to b4, attacking the pawn on b7 first, and now after b6, you go king to e3 here. And because the king is cut off and it can't get forward to the fourth rank, this is very simply a drawn endgame. So here we get c5 being played by Mittens. Now c5 leads directly to a forced draw. A sample line of how a human would play is, say, rook b2, king f3, and then c5 here. But after rook b5, king to e5, white can now go a5 here, breaking up this chain of pawns. And after you play king d4, ab6, or actually ab6 might still be a draw. ab6 here, rook takes b6, c4 is apparently winning here, I guess. Let's see, rook d7, king c5, rook d6, king c5, rook d7, c takes b3 is maybe winning actually, because after king e3, you can now go rook to h2, and if white plays king to d3, you can now go king b4, check king a3, king c3, rook c2, king d3, and then rook c8, and with the king cut off, this is actually winning here. So let's go back a second and see if Mittens actually missed a win. So after c5, rook b5, king e5, if king to e3 is played here, after king d5, a5, then king c6 traps the rook here, takes, rook has no squares. So maybe Mittens actually missed a win here when it played c5 instead of playing rook to b2. Now, whether that's a depth issue or what the issue is, it would appear that Mittens did blunder here and missed a win. It would appear that way. So In this position, we get c5 here, and now Stockfish just takes the rook, and after takes, king f3, this is a drawn endgame, even though black has one extra pawn here with a 3 versus 2, because one of the extra pawns is a stacked double pawn on b4. Game ends with king e5, king e3, a5, king d3, king d5, king e3, and now the only way to make progress is to play b5. You go back to e5, I go to d3. If you go to f4 here, now I can play king d4, king f3, king d3, and I can always just mirror your king no matter which way you go, and it's just very simply a draw. And if you go back to f6, maybe you can even go king c6 here, winning the pawn, but king d6 would also be more than enough, and you just always keep mirroring the black king. So we get b5 here, takes, king c5, and now b6 takes, king to d3, king b5, king c2, king c5, king d1, keeping the opposition. By the way, king to d3 would actually still draw the game, because after king d5 you can go king e3, and again you go this way running to b5, and if I go back you just wait on e3. King d1 also works, because after king to d4, king to d2, this is the classic zugzwang. If it's white's turn to move, white loses the game. So just to illustrate why, let's say we got this position. If white goes to c2, you go to e3, and then eventually you just keep moving the king up. You gobble, you have 2 pawns, and this is a simple win. But in this position here, after king d4, king d2, it's actually black's turn, and so it's zugzwang, where black doesn't want to move, black's move, and then white just starts mirroring the king wherever you go. Actually, sorry, if you go to f4, you should go to d2, and then again it's the same mirror where you keep the kings opposite each other. So here we get king to d5, king e1, king c5, king d1, king d5, king e1, and now again king e5, king d1, king e6. Kings just start dancing every which way, and finally we get a4 for Mittens, and finally the pawns come off, and the rest is pretty straightforward. Here we get king and pawn versus king, and eventually we have the stalemate here with b2 being played, king b1, and king b3, and the first game ends in a draw between Mittens and Stockfish level 7. So now let's move on to game number 2. Now, after playing Stockfish level 7, we now have Mittens playing against Stockfish level 8. One thing that I did not point out was these games were played with unlimited time, so there was no time set for the games. So second game, Stockfish level 8, the absolute top level of the engine on Lead Chess, and Mittens, the top engine on chess.com. Which engine is going to win? So we get e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight f3, and now we have the c6 variation being played by Stockfish. Now, I remember many years ago when I first started using computer programs, there was this program called Fritz4 that I used to play against, and one of the lines that it really liked was e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and c6. And at the time when I was around master, FIDE master level, I liked to play the Austrian attack with f4. But after f4, there's a very unusual line with queen to a5 here. And basically the point is to cheese your opponent. If white plays knight f3, you hang the pawn on e4 due to the pin. And if you play this move e5, black can now go knight to e4. And there's a lot of theory in this line nowadays. When I was much younger, some of the early computer programs really liked playing this against me. So it brings back some memories. So after c6, we get g3. Stockfish plays queen a5, bishop g2 played by Mittens, guarding the pawn on e4 here, pawn to e5, we get a3 here. Now a3 is a rather peculiar move, not a move that I really understand, but nonetheless it's played. We got bishop e7, knight g to e2, castles, knight bd7, and now we have queen to d3. The idea behind queen d3 I think is quite simple. White wants to bring the bishop into the game and then potentially the rook's to center, and or maybe play f4 or rook d1 here. I'm not sure of the exact reasoning. It does look a little bit questionable to me, because after black trades on d4 at some point, there's going to be knight to c5 here or knight to e5, both of which gain time or tempo by making white have to retreat the queen. So we get h6 played here, h3. Idea is to play bishop to e3. Now there's no knight to g4, attacking the bishop in the center. Queen c7 is played, and now we have bishop e3, b5, and now f4. After f4, Stockfish plays a5. The idea for Stockfish is simple. It wants to play bishop to a6 and b4, activating the bishop on this long diagonal. So we get d5, bishop to a6, and b4. Now again, getting back to basics, this is completely different than another opening, the Sicilian Nightor, but the theme is very similar, where you play b4, locking in the bishop. So you're probably wondering, what am I talking about? So let's go back to the very start. Now there's this very famous variation in the Nightor called the English attack, with bishop e3, e6, f3, black plays say b5, g4, knight bd7, queen to d2, h6, castles, bishop b7, white plays h4, and there are many ways for black to play here, but just to illustrate one of the old lines, black can play rook to c8 here, and after bishop to h3, their idea is like g5 potentially here, and the point is the same thing. White wants to go g5 and open up this diagonal for the light square bishop, but after g5, in this case, black is sacrificing a pawn, so it's kind of different, but nonetheless, the diagonal is closed, and you can't activate the light square bishop. So back to the game. So we get this position after b4, same situation where you cut off the bishop from a6 from coming into the game. We get rook fc8 being played by Stockfish, and now we have pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and now this move g4. Now there's a very big imbalance here in a couple of ways. First of all, black has moved a lot of pieces away from the king on the king side. Additionally, white is trying to push p on the king side and attack the king. But also the c2 pawn is very weak. The knight is a little bit weak on c3. So if white's not able to keep the queen side together here, it's very unlikely that your attack on the king side will be enough to win the game. So bishop b7 is played here by Stockfish. We get g5, all in, knight to h5, g takes h6, Stockfish trades off on b4, trades the rooks, and now goes e takes f4. Here Mittens chooses to play knight to d5, threatening the family fork if you were to take the bishop. After knight takes e7, the queen, the rook, and the king are all being forked at the same time. So we get bishop to f6 here, and now Mittens plays knight to d4, trying to use D's knights in the center of the board. If black takes knight, again, the fork is in play. So queen c4 is played by Stockfish. We get knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, and now bishop to d2 is played. Now already it's starting to go in the wrong direction here, because even though material is balanced, white has no attack on the king side. With these knights on h5 and f6, there is nothing happening here at all. So now it shifts to more of an endgame situation where white has to try and win the pawns on b5 and d6 and hope that you don't lose the pawn on e4 and lose the game. So we get knight takes e4, and now h takes g7 is played. Not bishop takes e4 here, because after takes, there's now knight to g3 here. If you go queen takes f4, there's queen takes d4, takes, and knight e2 at the fork. Although looking at this position more here, after king f1, knight d4, and h e7, rook takes c2, white should be okay with bishop to h6, rook to c8, and then something like rook to a5 here, because after knight f5, bishop f4 takes. Material is balanced here, and white should be okay. White should be okay here. So it's kind of peculiar that Mittens did not take the knight. Instead, it takes on g7. And now after knight hg3, these knights are really aggressive here. A lot of tricks with like queen d4 and knight e2 and some forks. And white seems to be in trouble. So Mittens plays bishop to f3, preventing the fork on e2. We get knight takes bishop. Bishop takes bishop, and now rook to c7 is played. Here we have rook to a8 check, king takes pawn, and now queen takes d2. And here Stockfish plays queen to f1, king h2, and now takes the bishop. Not queen to h1 checkmate here, because then there's the backward diagonal with bishop takes queen, and you go from winning to losing in 1 second. I think there was even a Reddit meme a while back where you think you're checkmating and you miss the backwards diagonal because the bishop is too far off the screen, and it's exactly one of those cases where you think it's over, and then suddenly you go from thinking it's over to being horrified at your blunder. Stockfish, of course, being 3,000 plus, is never going to make such a blunder. It plays rook takes bishop. Now we get queen to g2, stopping the checkmate and 1 on h1. We have rook c7 being played by Stockfish. Queens come off. King g2, knight to d2 being played here. Not knight to e3, by the way, because after king to f3, you would have to take the pawn on c2. And after knight takes b5, rook c6, there's rook to d8 here. All the pawns are coming off the board, and the game should end in a draw. So instead, we get knight to d2 here, and the idea is simple. Black wants to play for f3. We have knight takes b5, rook takes c2, and now we have rook to a6 here, and Stockfish decides to play d5. Now, again, this should be a draw with perfect play, but it's still kind of scary because the knight is guarding this f-pawn when the push happens with f4, f3, and white could end up in trouble. So here Mittens plays knight to d4. We get rook to c3, knight to f5, and now king h7 is played here. Again, the idea for Stockfish is to go f3 and knight to e4. If you play rook b6, f3, say king f2, there's knight to e4. The rook guards the pawn, knight checks the king, and you get checkmated instantly. So we have rook to h6 being played. We get king to g8, knight to e7, king to f8, and now knight takes d5 being played. Stockfish plays rook g3, king to f2, and now we have knight to e4. And after king to f1, we get this very nice move, rook to d3. Now, f3 looks good on first glance, but here white can play a simple move like rook to h8, king g7, and then rook h4. And after f5 is played, you go knight to e3, king to f6, and now you have rook to h5, going after the pawn on f5. If black plays a move like f2, you can take, and even rook takes f2, rook takes e3, rook to b2 is good enough to draw, because rook and knight versus rook is a theoretical draw. Nonetheless, we get rook to d3 being played here. Now the idea is very simple. After knight takes f4, you have rook to f3, checking the king and winning the knight at the same time. We get king to e2, rook takes f4, king to e3, and now we have rook to f6 being played. And after trades, we get king to d4 here, king to e7, and now king to e5. Now it's very interesting. Computer is saying that this is that this should be a draw, but knowing what happens in the game, it's a little bit peculiar that somehow black finds a magical miracle. So we get knight to h7, h4, king to d7, we get king d4, knight to f6, king to e5, knight h7, king d5, and you're thinking, well, it's gotta be a draw, right? We get king c7, h5 played here, and now after knight to f6, suddenly Mittens has made a mistake. We get king to e5, knight takes h5, king to f5, king to d7, king g5, knight g7, king to f6, and Mittens misses this move, king to e8. And the point is that now if you take the knight on g7, black's pawn is free to run down the board. Now, of course, if you bring the king back, you can never catch the pawn. It gets down the board immediately. And if you try to take the knight and go b5 here, the king is in the box to where the queening square is for the white pawn. Go f4, b6, king d8, b7, king c7. You catch the pawn on b7, and then you run the f pawn down the board and win the game. So it's very peculiar that Mittens did this. Now there's some question, maybe it was like a depth issue. Mittens just simply was not able to calculate and it's lost its mind for a second, because in this position you should never give up the h pawn. What you should play here is simply go king to d4, and after knight f6, king e5 would be a threefold repetition, and after king to c6 you go h5 here, and after king to b5 you go king c3. If black plays f5, now you can run the king back towards the pawn and it's a simple draw. And if black plays knight to f6, you go h6, keep the knight tied down to the pawn, and you just wait behind the b4 pawn until black starts pushing, and then inevitably your king gets over and you draw the game. Alas, Mittens has an error, whether it's like a hash, whether like it can't calculate, it simply loses its mind, which is why this occurs. And now after king to e8, white is effectively lost. So we get b5 being played, knight to e6, king to e5 is played here. You could play b6, but after knight to c5, the pawn can't go forward. Additionally, there's a threat of a fork with knight d7, so if you go to e5, there's the fork winning the game. And if you go to f5 here, now I can go knight to d7, b7, and now let's move king to d8. Because the knight covers this f6 square, king cannot move forward. So if you push the pawn, takes king f6, king e8 will simply be winning. And if you play king to g5 after king c7, if you go b8 queen, I take with the king. Again, you can't get in here, and this is simply a winning endgame with the king, knight, and pawn versus the king. And additionally, if you play king to h6 after takes king g7, now I push the f pawn again. You can't catch the pawn, and therefore black will win the game with this extra queen and knight. So effectively, the game is over here. So we get king e5, king d7, b6 is played, knight to d8 here, stopping the pawn but also guarding the pawn on f7. And after king d5, we get f6, king c5, king to e6, king d4, and now black just uses the king and the pawn, marches it up the board because the knight can always stop the pawn on b6. Game concludes with king c5, king e5, king c4, king to e4. Now f4 would be winning, and just to illustrate why it'd be winning, you guys, is that you can get this endgame where basically with the same position, king and pawn versus king, but with the knight and pawn on the board, you can now go knight to b7. White has to yield by moving the king, and now you go king e2 and get a queen, and this would have been another sample line which wins. But king e4 is also good enough. You box the king out, there's no entry back to the f1 square, and because of that, black is going to get a queen with the f pawn. So you get king c5, f4, king d6, f3, king e7, knight to b7, king d7, f2, king c6, queen takes, and now king d5. Of course, many ways to win, but the computer sees the quickest way, so it sacks the knight. King c8 is played, we get king to c6, king b8, and now queen to f7, king to c8, and queen to e8 is checkmate, and Stockfish level 8 does defeat Mittens. Now, having looked at both of these games fairly closely, it's clear to me that Mittens, whatever the issues are, it's very clear that it seems to have some horizon issues, some depth issues in some of these end games, because it appears that it was winning the previous game against level 7, but then it had that miscalculation near the end, and this is a similar case where it missed this idea with knight g7 and king e8, some moves back, and because of that, it loses a position which should have been a draw. So I don't know if it's like an issue with the depth or whatever, but clearly there's some issues that render it a little bit less than adequate. At any rate, Stockfish level 8 beats Mittens, Stockfish level 7 draws. I would say that in reality, probably if there weren't these issues with the depth, Mittens probably should have beaten level 7 and drawn level 8, so that the match score probably could have been flipped. Nonetheless, it is what it is. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video of us covering the bot supremacy, seeing which bot is the best. Now, I do think that chess.com probably will be improving the engine down the road, but nonetheless, it is what it is. Once again, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back very soon with some more great YouTube-only content. See you guys soon. Bye.